The cigarette between Colonel Takashi Yamamoto's fingers had burned down to ash, but he did not notice. His eyes were fixed on the map spread across the wooden table, tracing the American advance across the Pacific. Iwo Jima had fallen in March. Okinawa in June. Now, in the first week of August 1945, B-29 bombers struck Japanese cities almost daily, turning entire neighborhoods into infernos. Yet here in the command bunker outside Hiroshima, Yamamoto and his fellow officers still argued about supply routes as if victory remained possible. "We need more aircraft," Major Ishikawa insisted, jabbing his finger at the map. "Without air superiority, the home islands cannot be defended." Yamamoto said nothing. He had stopped believing in air superiority months ago. Japan's navy lay scattered across the ocean floor. Her finest pilots had been spent in kamikaze attacks that sank a few American ships but changed nothing. The war was lost. Everyone in this room knew it. No one dared say it. A young radio operator burst through the door, his face pale. "Colonel, a report from our spotters. A single B-29 has been detected approaching Hiroshima from the east." Ishikawa laughed. "One plane? The Americans usually send hundreds. Perhaps they are running out of bombers." The other officers chuckled, but Yamamoto felt something cold settle in his chest. One plane made no tactical sense. The Americans did not waste fuel on single aircraft missions. Something was wrong. "I need air," he muttered, pushing past his colleagues toward the bunker entrance. Outside, the morning of August 6, 1945, was warm and cloudless. Hiroshima spread across the delta below, a city of 350,000 people going about their Monday routines. Factory workers walked to their shifts. School children practiced fire drills in open fields, preparing for raids that had somehow spared their city so far. The Oda River sparkled under the rising sun. It was 8:14 in the morning. Yamamoto lit a fresh cigarette and watched the sky. He could hear the distant drone of the B-29's engines now, a single silver cross glinting at high altitude. So high that anti-aircraft guns could not touch it. So alone that it seemed almost peaceful. Then the sky cracked open. A flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns erupted over the city center. Yamamoto's vision went white. He felt heat wash over his face, hotter than any fire he had ever known, and then the shockwave hit like the fist of a god. The blast threw him backward through the bunker doorway, slamming him against concrete. His eardrums screamed. The world became nothing but light and noise and pain. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor, covered in dust. Blood dripped from his nose. The other officers were shouting, stumbling over each other in the darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, revealing cracked walls and shattered equipment. Yamamoto pulled himself up and staggered outside. What he saw stopped his heart. A pillar of fire rose over Hiroshima, climbing higher than any mountain, spreading into a mushroom shape that blotted out the sky. The city beneath it was gone. Where streets and houses had stood minutes ago, there was only a flattened wasteland of smoke and flame. The shockwave had knocked down every structure within 2 kilometers of the blast center. Fires were spreading in every direction, merging into a firestorm that would consume what little remained. Radio communications went dead. Telephone lines produced only static. Yamamoto commandeered a vehicle and drove toward the city as evening fell, leading a convoy of medics and soldiers who had no idea what they would find. Nothing had prepared them for this. Survivors wandered through the ruins like ghosts, their skin hanging from their bodies in sheets. A mother sat in the rubble, holding a child who no longer moved. A soldier, still in uniform, walked in circles calling a name that no one answered. The shadows of people who had been vaporized instantly were burned into stone walls and concrete steps. Permanent records of lives ended in a fraction of a second. The rivers were choked with bodies of those who had jumped in to escape the flames. Yamamoto found a veteran sergeant, a man who had fought in China and Manchuria and seen every horror war could offer. The sergeant was on his knees in the ashes, weeping like a child. What weapon did this? Someone asked. Yamamoto could not answer. He had studied every bomb the Americans possessed. Nothing in his training, nothing in his experience, nothing in his imagination had prepared him for this. This was not warfare. This was the end of the world. He returned to the bunker at midnight and filed his report. When asked to identify the weapon used, he wrote a single word: unknown. His hands would not stop shaking. They would never fully stop again. The reports arriving at Imperial General Headquarters made no sense. Admiral Somu Toyota read them 3 times, certain there had been some mistake. 1 bomb. 1 aircraft. 80,000 dead. Perhaps more. The numbers were impossible. Japan had endured months of firebombing that killed tens of thousands per raid, but those attacks required hundreds of B-29s dropping thousands of incendiary bombs. No single weapon could do what these reports described. This must be exaggeration, Toyota said, tossing the papers onto the conference table. Panic and hysteria from survivors. We need confirmation before presenting anything to the emperor. The other military leaders nodded, relieved to delay facing the truth. General Korechika Anami, the Minister of War, paced the room with clenched fists. He had spent his entire career preparing for this moment, when Japan would defend her sacred homeland against invasion. He was not ready to believe that the war had changed in a single morning, but the confirmation came anyway. Dr. Kenji Nishida arrived that afternoon, a physicist from Tokyo Imperial University who had spent years studying atomic theory. He was a small man with round glasses and ink-stained fingers, entirely out of place among the generals and admirals. Yet when he spoke, even Anami stopped pacing to listen. The Americans have achieved what we believed impossible, Nishida explained, his voice calm and precise. They have built an atomic bomb. A weapon that releases the energy stored within the nucleus of uranium or plutonium atoms. The explosion over Hiroshima was equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of conventional explosives, delivered by a single device weighing perhaps 4,000 kilograms. The room fell silent. Toyota felt the blood drain from his face. 15,000 tons. Japan's largest bombs contained less than 1 ton of explosive. The Americans had multiplied destructive power by a factor beyond comprehension. Can we build such a weapon? Anami demanded. Nishida shook his head slowly. We attempted similar research early in the war. We lack sufficient uranium, centrifuges, and industrial capacity. The Americans have spent $2 billion and employed over 125,000 workers on this project. We cannot replicate it. We do not have months. We may not have days. Anami's face turned red with fury. Then we fight without such weapons. We will arm every citizen. We will make them pay for every inch of Japanese soil in blood. The Americans may have their bomb, but they do not have our spirit. Lieutenant Hiroshi Endo stood in the corner of the room, taking notes as junior officers were expected to do. He had graduated from the military academy just 2 years ago, full of dreams of honorable service. Now he listened to his superiors discuss arming women and children with bamboo spears against a weapon that could erase entire cities in seconds. The mathematics were clear to him. If the Americans had 1 bomb, they might have more. Continued resistance would not lead to victory. It would lead to extinction, but speaking such thoughts meant treason. Officers had been executed for less. Endo kept his face blank and his pen moving, recording words he knew were madness. That evening, Emperor Hirohito requested a private briefing. The military leaders gathered their reports and rehearsed their confidence, but their hands trembled as they prepared. For the first time in this war, they would have to admit that Japan faced not just defeat but annihilation. Whispers spread through the corridors of power. The unthinkable was being spoken aloud. Perhaps the war must end. Perhaps surrender was the only path to survival. The generals who had promised victory now stared at maps that showed nothing but ashes, and the silence in their hearts was louder than any bomb. Endo walked through Tokyo that night, past buildings that might not exist tomorrow, past citizens who had no idea what was coming. He thought of Hiroshima, of the shadows burned into stone, of the rivers choked with the dead. He thought of his younger sister in Nagasaki, working at the Mitsubishi shipyards, building submarines that would never fight. He wanted to warn her, to tell her to run, but communications were restricted and he had no way to reach her. All he could do was wait and watch as history turned on its axis, as the old world burned away, and as Japan's military leaders finally began to understand that they had lost not just a battle but an entire era. The silence in Tokyo grew heavier with each passing hour. Somewhere across the Pacific, another bomb was being prepared. 3 days was not enough time. Not enough time to understand what had happened at Hiroshima. Not enough time to negotiate. Not enough time to surrender. But the Americans were not waiting. Lieutenant Hiroshi Endo arrived in Nagasaki on the morning of August 9, 1945, sent to assess industrial damage from conventional bombing raids. The Mitsubishi shipyard stretched along the harbor, still producing submarines and torpedoes for a war that everyone secretly knew was ending. Workers moved through the facilities with mechanical determination, building weapons that would rust in storage while their nation decided whether to live or die. Endo walked through the factory district as the sun climbed higher, taking notes on production capacity he knew would never matter. The city was nestled in a valley between mountains, a geography that had protected it from the worst of the firebombing campaigns. Nearly 250,000 people lived here, going about their daily routines, unaware that they had become a target. That he paused at a small cart where an elderly woman sold rice balls wrapped in seaweed. Her hands were weathered from decades of work, but her smile was warm. Behind her, children chased each other through an alley, their laughter echoing off the walls. A pregnant woman walked past, one hand resting on her belly, the other carrying a basket of vegetables. Ordinary life, precious and fragile, continuing despite everything. Endo thought of his sister, somewhere in this city, and wished he could find her. But his orders were clear, and time was short. He purchased a rice ball, thanked the woman, and continued toward the hills east of the city center, where he could get a better view of the harbor facilities. At 11:02 in the morning, he was climbing a hillside path 3 miles from ground zero. The flash came without warning. A light so intense it seemed to burn through his closed eyelids, painting the world in white fire. Endo threw himself to the ground instinctively, covering his head as the shock wave roared over him, flattening trees and sending debris flying through the air. The sound arrived next, a crack of thunder that shook the mountain itself, followed by a roar that went on and on. When he raised his head, he saw it. The mushroom cloud, identical to the photographs from Hiroshima that had circulated through headquarters, rising over Nagasaki like the pillar of some ancient and terrible god. Orange and black and gray, climbing miles into the sky, spreading outward as it rose. The city below was already burning. Endo stumbled down the hillside, his ears ringing, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. The industrial district had vanished. The shipyards were twisted metal and flame. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened as if pressed down by a giant hand. And everywhere, people were dying. He found the rice ball cellar near where her cart had stood. She was still alive, but barely. Her skin was burned black on one side, white on the other where her body had shielded itself from the initial flash. She grasped his hand with surprising strength and asked him to find her grandchildren. He promised he would try, knowing it was a lie. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare from which there was no waking. Survivors with melted faces begging for water. A school where children had been practicing drills, now a crater filled with small bodies. The rivers turning red as the wounded crawled toward any source of relief from the burning. Endo helped where he could, carrying survivors to aid stations that had no medicine, no bandages, no hope. As darkness fell, he found a working radio and transmitted his report to Tokyo. His voice was flat, mechanical, emptied of all emotion because feeling anything would have destroyed him. Nagasaki has been struck by the same weapon used on Hiroshima, he said. Estimated casualties in the tens of thousands. Industrial facilities destroyed. The city center no longer exists. The officer on the other end asked for specific numbers. Endo paused. He thought of the woman who sold rice balls, of the children who had been laughing in the alley, of his sister whose fate he might never know. He thought of a war that had killed millions and a weapon that could kill millions more. Everyone, he finally said. Everyone is a casualty now. He set down the radio and walked into the burning night, one more ghost among the ruins of the world that had been. The war cabinet had been arguing for 14 hours. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the underground conference room beneath the Imperial Palace as Japan's military leaders fought their final battle, not against the Americans but against each other. General Anami stood at one end of the table, his uniform immaculate, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. Surrender is unthinkable. We have 28 million men who can be mobilized for the defense of the homeland. We will make the Americans pay such a price in blood that they will negotiate an honorable peace. Admiral Toyota sat silently, staring at the table. He had not spoken in hours. The reports from Nagasaki had broken something inside him. 2 cities erased. Perhaps 150,000 dead from 2 bombs. And intelligence suggested the Americans had more. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo leaned forward. If we continue fighting, there will be no homeland left to defend. The Americans will burn every city, kill every citizen. Japan will cease to exist not as a nation but as a people. The argument circled endlessly, neither side willing to yield. Outside the palace walls, the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and was sweeping through Manchuria, adding another enemy to a war already lost. Time was running out. At 2 o'clock in the morning on August 10, Emperor Hirohito entered the room. The military leaders rose and bowed, falling silent in the presence of their living god. Hirohito was a small man with a quiet voice, more comfortable studying marine biology than ruling an empire. But in this moment, the weight of millions of lives rested on his shoulders. I have listened to the arguments on both sides, he said softly. I have given this matter my deepest consideration. The time has come to bear the unbearable. We must accept the Allied terms and end this war. Tears streamed down the faces of generals who had never wept in battle. Anami bowed his head, his dreams of honorable resistance crumbling to dust. The emperor had spoken. The war was over, but not everyone accepted the decision. On the night of August 14, a group of young army officers launched a coup. They called it the Kyujo Incident, a desperate attempt to seize the imperial palace and destroy the recording of the emperor's surrender announcement before it could be broadcast. If they could prevent the Japanese people from hearing their emperor's voice, perhaps the war could continue. Lieutenant Endo had returned to Tokyo that morning, hollow-eyed and silent, carrying memories of Nagasaki that would haunt him forever. He was in the palace complex when the shooting started, caught between rebel soldiers who wanted to fight to extinction and palace guards loyal to the emperor's decision. His former instructor, Major Hatanaka, led the rebels. They had trained together, shared meals together, believed in the same vision of Japanese glory. Now Hatanaka pressed a pistol into Endo's hands. Join us, he urged. Help us save Japan's honor. Help us continue the fight. Endo looked at the weapon, then at the man who had once been his mentor. He thought of Hiroshima, of shadows burned into stone. He thought of Nagasaki, of children who would never grow up. He thought of his sister, whose body he might never find. There is no honor in extinction, he said quietly. Only in surviving to remember. He dropped the pistol and walked away. Behind him, Hatanaka shouted curses and threats, but did not fire. The coup collapsed hours later when the commanding general refused to support it. Hatanaka shot himself on the palace grounds as dawn broke over Tokyo. At noon on August 15, 1945, radios across Japan crackled to life. For the first time in history, the emperor's voice reached the ears of his subjects, speaking words that ended an empire and began a new era. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Soldiers knelt in the streets. Women wept. Men who had been prepared to die for their emperor now had to learn to live for their country. Weeks later, Colonel Yamamoto and Lieutenant Endo met in the ruins of Hiroshima. They walked together through ashes that had once been homes, past monuments of destruction that would stand as warnings to all humanity. They did not speak of victory or defeat. Such words had lost their meaning. What do we do now? Yamamoto asked. Endo knelt beside a pile of rubble. Something green was pushing through the ash, a small plant reaching toward the sun. Life, somehow, impossibly, continuing. We remember, he said. We rebuild. And we make sure the world never forgets what we saw here. The two men stood in silence as the wind scattered ashes across the empty plain, carrying the voices of the dead toward a future they would never see but had helped to shape.